Polling in the United States is well and truly underway. There's also a fierce psychosis that seems to have gripped the country. Non-scalable fences are being erected at the White House and in front of stores in Manhattan and elsewhere. In front of some of the swankier stores in New York, they've put up huge boards, wooden planks for safety. An uneasy calm prevails in America before the results as the threat of a civil war looms. Gun sales have soared, so much so that there have been reports from gun stores in some cities that guns and ammunition are no longer available. At this moment, for every 100 American citizens, there are 120 guns across mainland United States. It almost seems, when you look at it from the outside, that America seems to be preparing for a kind of civil war. This is not going to be an ordinary peaceful election. That, at least in the United States, there is apprehension that over the next several hours and days, the situation in the US could get violent and grim.
Arming and securing. Not just the ordinary Americans, non-scalable fencing is also built around the world's most powerful address. America is making a choice between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. The circumstances are unprecedented in American history. A country battling its worst public health crisis in a century. Inflamed passions over race. And job losses. If all that wasn't enough, Trump has partly stoked concerns with his repeated claims that the presidential election could be rigged because of prolonged count of postal ballots.
I think it's a terrible thing when ballots can be collected after an election. I think it's a terrible thing when people or states are allowed to tabulate ballots for a long period of time after the election is over, because it can only lead to one thing, and that's very bad. You know what that thing is. I think it's a very dangerous, terrible thing. And I think it's terrible when we can't know the results of an election the night of the election in a modern-day age of computer.
As fears of post-election violence loom in the United States, gun sales have surged across America. The owner of this firearms store in the battleground state of Pennsylvania says his wares are flying off the shelf.
I'll tell you, the current environment as far as guns go, if you took everything that Obama did, everything that Clinton did, and all the school shootings, and combined them all, they would not equal what's going on right now in the firearms industry. That's how much greater this is this time.
America has more guns in the hands of civilians than it has civilians. About 120 guns per 100 people. According to official data, firearm sales are up by 80% in swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin this year.
A number of militias have come up through the country, and they promise to go around polling places to keep the peace, as it were. This is, according to Democrats, one way of intimidating their voters. According to Republicans, one way of protecting their rights.
With healthcare, employment, and peace at greater risk than ever from a potential unrest, Americans are boarding up their properties. That's how storefronts across the US are preparing for threats ranging from possible spontaneous attacks to planned violence.
ahead of this election, reports show that millions of guns have already been sold. And the fear is being driven on both sides. There are people who say that they are scared of people who have been protesting racial injustice. And then there are people who say they are scared of the right-wing militias, which they have sometimes seen on the streets during protests. So this uncertainty is driving the gun sales and benefiting the gun rights and the powerful gun lobby of this country.
Trump's objections to mail-in voting has impacted his supporters. Remember, Americans have rushed to vote early. More than 95 million cast their ballots already before the election day. Tempers are running high.
We've been getting middle finger stuff thrown at us all for the past hour and a half that we've been here.
An unsettling sensation in the countdown to the election day. With Aviruk Sen in Texas and Pratiksha Gildial in Washington, Bureau Report, India Today.
A few weeks ago, the gap between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, according to the opinion polls in the United States, was about 10%. That's now come down to 8%. Ordinarily, 8% in a bipolar election is enough to see Joe Biden through. But given what happened in 2016, American pollsters and pundits this time being very cautious. Also, remember, elections in the US work very differently from the way that they do in India. You don't win every seat. Every seat doesn't take you to parliament. You have to win the electoral college in that particular state, and you carry all the delegates of that state. So that changes the dynamics. Who's more likely to win? And is the threat of civil war real, or is this just everyone getting unnecessarily paranoid? What happens if there is no clear winner? To try and help understand the answers to some of these questions, I have a very distinguished panel I want to start introducing, beginning with Professor Steve Jarding, teaches public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, considered one of the world's top experts on political management and campaigning. We've got G. Balachandran, a very fine, distinguished scholar in his own right, but here today in his special capacity as the maternal uncle of Kamala Harris, has very sharp views and also reflects what this means for the entire family. We've got Meera Shankar. She served as India's ambassador to the United States from 2009 to 2011, one of our finest IFS officers. Professor Amitabh Mattu joins us, teaches international politics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, also visiting professor at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University in the US. We've got Dana Milbank, American author, columnist for the Washington Post. We've got Vijay Chautaiwala. He runs the Foreign Affairs Division for the Bharatiya Janata Party. And for a perspective of what's happening at polling booths on the ground, we're joined by Carolyn Presutti, Voice of America's correspondent in Washington, D.C. So welcome to all our guests. Steve Jarding, I want to come to you first. This report that we've been reading of how in swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, gun sales up 80%, ammunition sales across the US up 139%. It almost seems, when you see this from the outside, that America is preparing for some kind of a civil war rather than a normal democratic transition. What's going on?
Well, I don't read too much into that for this reason. Every time in the last several election cycles when America's held elections, particularly when it looked like a Democrat had a chance to win, Republicans and the National Rifle Association kind of spike and say we have to buy guns because it looks like the Republicans are going to lose and Biden's going to take our guns. We've never banned a hunting gun in American history ever. It's all just kind of smoke and mirrors. But I think it's less, Rahul, about some sort of pending civil war, although I fully expect that there will be violence at some levels in the United States. Certainly if President Trump loses, he's encouraged it. He's suggested people would go to the streets and be violent, almost suggesting that he would be okay with that. But with regard to the sales themselves, it's not unusual ahead of an election, particularly, again, if Trump were way ahead in the polls, my guess is you wouldn't see the run on gun stores. Trump's behind in the polls. The gun people and the National Rifle Association do a great job of telling people you better buy your guns now because if a Democrat gets in, they're going to ban them. I think that's more what's going on here than any kind of underground civil unrest that's going to explode on Election Day, or tomorrow probably, if not tonight. But as I said, I do think there's going to be violence at some level. I would be shocked if there's not. I just don't think it's probably at the level that the gun sales would suggest, because I think the sales are based on other factors.
Carolyn Prasetti, you're tracking voter turnout at polling booths in DC and elsewhere. How strong is the enthusiasm, given the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and also given the fact that 90 million Americans have already voted in this election?
All good points. Just take a look behind me at this long line. We're currently in Wilmington, Delaware, the home of Democrat Joe Biden. And just look at how many people are voting in this presidential election. This line not only extends into the building, but it also wraps around the block. I talked to someone at the front of the line, and she said she's waited upwards of 2 hours in order to be able to cast her ballot. But as you mentioned, a lot of people voting ahead of time. In fact, 2/3 of the amount of voters that voted in the 2016 election have already cast their ballots. And that's one reason why we think we might not have a winner tonight. We might not have a winner tomorrow. We might not have a winner in a week, because it's going to take the individual states to count those ballots as per their laws. Some states rather, have already counted those early ballots, and all they have to do is press a button and then it tabulates. Other states didn't start counting until this morning. Some states have been given the okay that if those ballots are postmarked by today, they can count them as late as 3 days, one state even as late as 9 days. Now, those states also are swing states. So that means it could go either way. It could go for the challenger Joe Biden, or it could go for President Donald Trump. We don't know. And as you mentioned in the polls, they are close. These men are neck and neck. We've seen a range of 4 to 10%, depending on which poll you are quoting. But these men are very close. Both of them, again, out on the campaign trail today. Joe Biden in the very important swing state of Pennsylvania, also here in Delaware. He'll be speaking to the nation about 2 kilometers from where I stand. It's an enormous stage that's already been set up, red, white, and blue lights all over. And he will address the nation. We don't know if that will be a congratulatory speech, a successor speech, or a concession speech. Or he may just come out and we still don't know who what. But I asked, when will that speech?
Carolyn Prasetti, thank you very much for joining us from Delaware with your perspective from the ground. Dana Milbank, if I were to look at this purely from a psephological perspective, an 8% lead in a bipolar election, with all the Republican states being the states which are seeing close fights, the Democrat states seem to be in the bag as far as most opinion polls are concerned. This would suggest that Joe Biden is going to make his way to the White House. Are pollsters in the United States and pundits being overly cautious because of all the egg souffle that they had coming their way after what happened in 2016? Let me put that same question for a moment to Professor Amitabh Mattu. If you look at it just from an elections perspective, an 8% gap on the at the time when polling has started, with 90 million voters already having cast their vote. Most pundits think that a majority of them are likely to be Democrat voters. This election should ordinarily be in the bag for Biden. Why is it then that America and the rest of the world is so tense?
I think, first of all, there are huge stakes in this election for the American people and for the rest of the world. But you were right. I think the fact that pollsters, including respected pollsters like Nate Silver and others, got it wrong, they're being extra cautious. If you don't take a microscopic view of each state, each county, and take a larger view of things, I think it's Biden's in the bag. I think Biden and Kamala Harris will win, and win early, and will win with perhaps 300 plus seats in the Electoral College. They'll, of course, win the popular vote, as Hillary did last time. So I really don't think I would question. In fact, I'd encourage you to probably congratulate Balachandran as being the second uncle of the United States soon enough in 2-3 days. So perhaps you could use this opportunity, because after today, he might now become a very rare. He's looking already very distinguished with his well-trimmed personality, but he'll become extremely rare to get to a television studio with all the paraphernalia that will surround him shortly.
Mr. Balachandran, you're being called the second uncle of the United States by Amitabh Mattu. He's being a bit cheeky. But what's the mood in the family? And also, how have you seen Kamala Harris's campaign on the Biden ticket?
Look, as far as Kamala's choice as Biden's running mate, it was more or less foregone when Biden said that he was going to have a woman as his vice president nominee. Because when I looked at the other contenders, there are a lot of things that stood out in favor of Kamala. First of all, she has won statewide elections in California, which is the biggest state. Two, she was the Attorney General of California and settled some of the biggest lawsuits against various firms during the financial crisis. Three, she has been very active in the civil rights movement from her very young age. And finally, she, as a law enforcement officer, she had brought about a number of reforms in California, police, let's say procedures. And those who have watched her during the hearings, Senate judiciary hearings, know that she's a very sharp and to the point, person. When she was questioning William Barr or the other Supreme Court nominee, she didn't, during the Barnett, she didn't do that. So for all these reasons, I felt that it was more or less inevitable that Biden would choose her.
But she's been viciously attacked by President Trump. And you know, I was listening to what he was saying early this morning. He said that, yes, we want a woman as president of the US at some point in time, but this cannot be the first woman to be president of the United States. It was a racial attack of sorts against Kamala Harris, and she's had to face a lot of that since she was chosen to be Joe Biden's running mate.
Oh, now look, Biden is a realist, he's not a dogmatic person, okay? So he knows that she attacked him, that was all part of the game, okay? But the way she did was the one that got the major attention, okay? So I don't think it played much role. I mean, the advisors felt that way, but I don't think Biden felt very strongly about that, okay? So I do think that it was more or less an automatic choice at that time.
Okay, Amitabh Mattu called you. I saw that, and I'm sure you heard that as well, the second uncle to be, and you very diplomatically ducked that. What's at stake personally for the family, given her roots going back to Chennai? We saw at the institute where her mother studied. You know, we saw Padma Lakshmi's conversation with Kamala Harris being called Chitti, and that really is creating quite a buzz, especially in the South Asian community in the US, and everyone who knows her here.
No, it is true. Look, she has got quite strong family connections, okay? That is because both her mother and the time she spent with my parents, her grandparents in Chennai. So there's no question that she was very much devoted to their family side from her very young age. Now, as far as being that, people, and she's quite adaptable, you know. I mean, it's not that she's dogmatic. Like I told somebody, when she was running for district attorney of San Francisco, I was with her, so I used to go around with her. There was a gentleman who had killed a cop. She said, I'll work for his conviction, but not for his death penalty, because I'm against death penalty.
No, but I'm sure you're aware of the apprehensions in many quarters, Mr. Balachandran, in India, about Kamala Harris, if she were to become vice president, if Biden wins, interfering in India's internal affairs. President Trump has largely minded his own business, not interfered in India's internal affairs, whether it's on the issue of Article 370, what's happening in Kashmir, or anything else that the Modi government's been doing. And the sense is, given her past pronouncements especially, that she may be poking her nose into India's internal affairs much more than the previous administration?
Look, you have to define the term interference. If somebody makes a comment that something you should correct, I mean, if you call every negative or any criticism of India as an interference, then you should also withdraw from international relations completely. And two, she was not a government official as a government official statement. A lot of Indian politicians make statements about US. Does it mean they are interfering in US affairs? And so let's be very clear. Unless we know what is meant by interference, there's no point in saying that somebody says, look, I am worried about some of the situations in India, therefore she is interfering. Okay? I don't buy that. There are Indians who buy that, but I don't buy that.
Okay. Vijay Chaitawala helps bring together Prime Minister Modi's campaigns when he travels internationally. He's very deeply plugged into the Indian community outside India. Mr. Chaitawala, what does the BJP and what do you personally make of the US elections? I'm not going to ask you who you think is likely to win, but what do you think is at stake for India in terms of the final outcome?
Rahul, I am watching US elections since 1992 when Mr. Bill Clinton won for the first time, and I was in US as a student, research scholar. And this election is the most exciting and most unpredictable elections I have ever seen since then. As far as India is concerned, we are ready to deal with whosoever wins. We will be driven by our interest, and US interest and Indian interest, they converge to a large extent. And there is a bipartisan support on both the sides of aisle in US, and there is a overwhelming support for a very strong India-US relationship in India. So there will be some changes, of course, if the Biden-Harris team wins the election, but I don't see that there will be substantial and paradigm shift in the US policy towards India, vice versa.
Are you concerned about
India's policy
much more
towards
interference from the Democrats if Joe Biden were to become president on internal issues in India, which Donald Trump and the Republican administration didn't particularly care about?
No, we are not concerned excessively. Of course, the issues will be different to deal with. With Republican administration also, there was not 100% alignment. For example, on H-1B visa, etc., the policies of Republican administration was much tougher, which generally Democratic administration has a very lenient and liberal views. So the issues to deal with will be different, but two friends can have some sincere differences of opinion, but the strength of the relationship, especially the series of agreements which we have signed in last 5-6 years, part of which we have signed in fact during Mr. Obama also. So it shows that change in administration is not likely to substantially change the India-US equations.
Okay, Dana Milbank is an author and a columnist with the Washington Post. With an 8% gap in the poll of polls, when polling is on in a two-cornered fight, if you're looking at this election from the outside, you'd say American pundits and pollsters are being overly cautious because they got 2016 horribly wrong. That this is an election that's sailed in favor of Joe Biden, because if you look at it, it's mostly the Republican wins from 2016 which are now the tight races, whereas virtually everything the Democrats won seemed to be comfortably in the Democrat bag. So are pundits being overly cautious in your view, sir?
I think they're being deliberately cautious because of the surprise of 2016. And also because it's not really just a popular vote in the United States. It seems very clear that Joe Biden's going to win the popular vote, and probably by a very large margin. But as you know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016. So it's about the Electoral College, and it will come down to the same half dozen, 10 states that it has in the past. Now, Joe Biden's looking very strong in those states as well. Anyway, it would be a a huge shock here if Donald Trump did prevail. It will not be a huge shock here if Donald Trump is disputing the election, whether that's in court or in the streets.
Meera Shankar, what's at stake for the world? Not just for India, but in this contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, what do you think is at stake for the rest of the world and for mankind?
Well, firstly, I think they offer very different visions of America and very different approaches to core policy issues, whether it is the pandemic, whether it is the economy, whether it is foreign policy, or whether it is issues such as energy and climate change. So clearly, there is a paradigm difference between the policies that the two candidates espouse. And therefore, for the world, whichever one wins is going to determine how American influence plays out in the world. You've had President Trump, who has walked away from international agreements, most important, the climate change agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an economic free trade agreement, and the Iran nuclear deal. So you have three key agreements from which President Trump has walked out. And here, Joe Biden says that he will rejoin the Paris Agreement and also look at a more ambitious agenda. And he hopes to pledge, that America will be carbon emission free by 2050, and that in terms of electricity, it will be carbon emission free by 2035. And he has a whole, agenda for infrastructure and renewable research and innovation, which he thinks is going to power the American economy and American technology. The other major area you're going to see a difference is on Iran, where Joe Biden has said that if Iran continues to adhere to the nuclear deal, he could consider rejoining the deal, which would mean, again, a fundamental shift in the US approach towards Iran under President Trump, which has basically been to apply pressure and to rely on the Gulf states and Israel to take the isolation of Iran forward in the region. The third area where I would see a difference is in terms of the importance that Biden is going to give to alliance partners, because President Trump, to some extent, upended traditional US policy and basically asked, what are we doing here? Why are we here in Asia? Why is NATO important? I mean, he asked very fundamental questions about the pillars of American foreign policy. And Biden will work to restore the strength of these alliances, particularly NATO, and also to look at their traditional alliances in Asia to meet with the challenge of China.
Professor Steve Jardine, one of the biggest points of conversation in the US media has been what happens if Donald Trump doesn't accept the verdict. If he's ahead in a few hours from now, without waiting for the mail-in ballots to be counted, how real is the fear that President Trump could declare himself winner and not wait for the final verdict? And what happens then?
Well, I think the odds are pretty good that he would declare himself the winner, even if all the votes aren't counted. That would fit kind of his modus operandi. That's who he is, and he's already flagged that, suggesting, we need to know on election night. He knows all the votes won't be in. He knows a lot of the votes that aren't in aren't going to be his votes. So the odds are pretty good that he'll do that. The verdict is out as to what that will mean if he declares victory and then tomorrow and the day after the votes keep coming in and it looks like he's slipping, he'll of course claim, see, I told you it's a corrupt vote count, and they're stealing the election. That's where I think the danger is, because he has already again signaled that he would fire up his kind of hardcore base to try to go to the streets and cause some problems. I do think, however, that one staple of U.S. elections that has been firm throughout our history is that when an election is over and the votes are counted, even if it took several days beyond tonight, that Americans tend to want to honor that. We tend to want that peaceful transition. And my personal belief is that even if there is some rioting, even if there is some violence, even if Trump claims victory and then the votes come in and Biden moves ahead, that the American political apparatus and the parties will come together and say, we have to stop this man. We can't, Donald Trump, you lost the election, fair and square. That's how we do it. We have peaceful transition of powers, and we're going to honor that. And you would get anything from the different branches of the military, potentially the Secret Service, that are going to be working with the incoming team, the Biden-Harris team, to begin that transition. And my guess would be that would be overwhelming, because remember, at that point, Trump loses his title. And if Biden is declared the winner, if it's 2 or 3 days from now, whatever it is, he's still the winner. And all of a sudden, the power that Donald Trump had with the title of president now officially is former president, and that transition begins. So I'm not saying it'll be seamless. I'm not saying it won't be choppy, because Trump will make it choppy. Trump will try to mix this up and suggest the election's being stolen. But my guess is the apparatus of the United States government, for this peaceful transition of power that we have had throughout our history, will kick in, and it will ultimately defeat the voices of Trump.
We could very quickly be in uncharted territory. And remember, the big fear, Seema Sirohi, in global geostrategic circles is that if this transition in the United States turns out to be messy and violent over a long stretch, China could use that period of uncertainty to try and mount a military offensive against Taiwan. They've been wanting to attack and claim Taiwan for the longest time, and therefore it is in the interest of the world that this transition be peaceful and orderly, regardless of who wins or who loses.
Absolutely. I think as far as the vote goes, unless there are some really big court challenges, the transition should go on peacefully. Because, you know, away from the spotlight, there is a team already in place, and the Trump administration has assigned an officer to liaison with the Biden campaign. So things are happening behind the scenes that would ensure a peaceful transfer. The thing that I fear is the verdict landing up in the courts in a big way, or if Republicans mount multiple legal challenges that have to be sorted out, and that muddies the waters. And, you know, in the meantime, Trump declares victory or whatever. I think that's a very sort of uncharted territory.
So Dana, right, that's the question. If President Trump announces, I'm the winner, even if he's not, doesn't wait for the final results to come in, can he, for example, call in the army? We know that the Supreme Court in the United States is skewed heavily towards conservatives. If multiple Republican petitions were to go to the courts, you know, what do you think could happen in such a scenario?
I think we know from past experience, the most recent being when you know, General Mike Milley said that he made a mistake. So I think the Pentagon would be very, very cautious if they're called upon to deploy the military against the American people. I think there's every chance they would disobey the order and, you know, call it illegal under some, you know, kind of rule. I don't think the military is ready to go.
Dana Milbank, can I have your perspective on this as well? If President Trump were to declare himself winner, can he call in the U.S. military?
Yeah, I think the notion of that you're describing here, like an attempted coup d'etat, is quite far-fetched. Of course, the president's going to declare victory before the votes are counted, but it's not up to the president of the United States. It's up to the 50 states to decide who their electors go to. There's a process that was set up in our Constitution more than 200 years ago. There's no sign that that process is going to fall apart. Now, there may be some violence, which is very unusual in American politics. There certainly will be court challenges, but the law is fairly cut and dried on this. So I don't think we need to, start looking at scenarios involving the military, although I agree they would certainly not be at all interested in a coup d'etat. The turnout here, we've seen already 100 million Americans turn out. That's a vast number. They're expecting election turnout of 2/3 of eligible voters by the end of today. And that would be the highest we've had in the United States in about 120 years. So when the people speak, and they speak emphatically, there's not a whole lot to worry about in terms of whatever Donald Trump's shenanigans will be.
Okay, this is very interesting. We're in fact in the middle of election ourselves, and then just before this in 2019, our polling was over in a very orderly fashion. The counting happened just in a matter of a few hours. So therefore, to have this notion that in a worst-case scenario, it is till the 5th of January that the US may not know who won the election, that just seems very far-fetched, given that polling will end in a few hours. But it will be very interesting to see what happens. For the time being, Meera Shankar, Professor Amitabh Mattu, Steve Jarding, Nana Milbank, Vijay Chautawala and G. Balachandran for joining us. Thank you very much. We're slipping into a very, very quick break right now. I'll have more for you. And remember, our coverage of the US presidential election continues all through the night tonight and from early in the morning tomorrow. So not just are we covering what's happening in Bihar, we're keeping a very close eye on what is, at this moment, the most important election in the whole world. I'll have more for you on the other side of a quick break. Stay with us.